As you'll be well aware, through this first module, we aim to focus your attention on studying education. In Topic 1, we explored key ideas related to the question, what is education? And in Topic 2, we unpacked some key ideas about the purpose of education. As stated in the introduction, in this topic we continue to extend and perhaps provide a rationale for these understandings by contemplating the history of education. I've broken the topic down into 3 key concepts. This video presents a brief overview of the concepts identified in your chapter as the double history of schooling, please be sure to have read chapter 2 of your text, but also understand that this chapter represents or presents a backdrop to the stage on which our thinking about this topic will take place. It's quite a dense chapter with quite a detailed explanation of particularly some sections of the history of education, so we don't expect you to hold on to all of that information, but it is important that you've read it. As I said, this particular presentation is going to be looking at the double history of schooling. Throughout this presentation, I'll identify this doubleness by highlighting the history of the formation of institutions that we collectively identify as schools, alongside the intent or aim of the educative practices undertaken within them. So this chronology starts with the philosophical schools established in ancient Greece around 300 BC and that remained in existence up until 529 AD. As the name suggests, these schools, or scholes, were established by the philosophers of the time, including well-known philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus and Zeno. The aim of these institutions was to train young men, particularly those destined for nobility and power, to think well and speak well through the study of dialectics and logic, to live well in the physical world through the study of physics, and to relate well to others through the study of ethics. These institutions enabled the reproduction and transformation of the practice of philosophy. If we consider the doubleness here, we might be thinking about the interdependence of these practices and the institution in terms of who had access to this education and who did not. Monastic schools emerged around 100 AD, and though many of the ethical philosophies associated with living well were in accordance with the Christian doctrine, differences about what constituted a Christian way of life and where that knowledge was sourced eventually led to the demise of the philosophical schools. Monastic schools were established by the Catholic Church throughout the Roman Empire. The text provides a rich and detailed history of this period. The aim of these schools was to teach a Christian way of life and to disestablish pagan religions by spreading Christianity throughout the empire. Throughout this period, monasteries became conservatories for practices including, but not limited to, arts and crafts, technical skills, knowledge and culture. Monastic practices are traditionally associated as being the reserve of monks. However, these monastic schools transcended monastery walls to include lay people who could afford to pay for an education. These practices led to the formation of a skilled and literate class, well versed in the doctrine of the Holy Roman Empire, and they formed powerful allies for the Church. Town schools and universities emerged during the 12th century AD and eventually took over the monastic schools. The purpose of town schools was to ensure the masters and apprentices in particular guilds preserved the practices of their trades. Universities were established around the same time by papal or royal decree to promote and progress the practices associated with the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge. This is a really interesting history, and the text goes into the formation of the degrees and the attribution of names such as bachelors to these. Importantly for this conversation, though, the conversation about teaching is about when teaching became known as a profession and studying a legitimate and practical endeavour for a wider range of classes. Books, once a rare and precious commodity, became the tools of trade, and began to be mass-produced. By the middle 19th century, access to education had become widespread, though by no means universal, as children from poor and marginalised groups continued to be excluded. Compulsory mass education institutions, which we'll collectively call schools, were established to create a workforce and instill the habits and dispositions required to be a good citizen. The practices associated with this form of educational institution, described in the text as the education complex, work together to regulate, prescribe, evaluate educative practices using student outcomes as a metric or measure. Returning to what we know about what constitutes educative practices, I'd like you to now reflect on the double history of schooling to consider how or if various forms over time address the technical, practical and critical elements of education. How did they attend to the formation of both individuals and society? How and who, in these particular periods of history, benefited from an education understood as living well in a world worth living in? Finally, following the text, we know that as new institutions were formed, new and different practices emerged, and that these different institutions or schools reflect the ideas and hopes of society at that point in time. In the next presentation, we consider how institutionalised formations of educational practices vis-à-vis schools and the systems that they sit within have the capacity to create tensions between the practice of education and schooling.